Hey, Helena.
Hey, Gustaf.
How are you?
I'm good. Really quite good,
Good to hear.
considering the state of the world and so forth.
Yeah, I hear you. So I'm so curious, and I'm so happy that I get to speak to you. I feel like you're a well of knowledge in a lot of areas where I lack. So, I, what can you tell me? How do you define the problem, and what's your idea of solutions?
The problem, I realized that I was thrown into this very unusual situation of going back in time to witness what life was like before industrial modernity. And I really, every day, the last 50 years that I've been active trying to raise awareness, everywhere in the world I go, and I've been on every continent, I would say the problem is the global economic system that is shaping the direction of every society now. And that is the problem behind virtually every single problem that we humans have on this planet, from the depression and the inner self-rejection to the divisiveness, polarization, to the forever wars and the forever chemicals. Blindly, we have ended up supporting or at least allowing a system to develop into a monstrous scale that has been influencing and shaping the direction of our societies. But what gives me so much hope and why I'm so active is that I see everywhere that people don't want this and that people are managing inside that system, going against the tide of this pressure from an artificial system. They're moving towards nature. They're listening to their own bodies, to their own hearts, to their guts. And despite all the misinformation, they've discovered the link even between their gut biome and the soil biome. They've discovered again and again that what they need to do is to work with life, with the living, this living miraculous world that we're a part of. And so there are these two trends going on at the same time. And once you see it more clearly, I think you cannot help but feel more hopeful, more empowered, and certainly more committed to raising awareness about basically seeing more clearly what's going on.
And this economic system, in what way would you say that is problematic? Like how I know I do the same, and I agree with you 100% in your formulation about the problem. But what specifically about the economic system is so destructive and counter nature and counter human?
I would say that fundamentally the problem is that this system imposed monoculture on the world, biological monoculture and human monoculture, by allowing an elite to drive people away from the land, away from the living world on which we all depend, but driving people away from the land in their region to, in an urban center, compete over artificially scarce goods and later artificially scarce money that was delivered from a global elite system. So the global trade and the global traders from the outset were a destructive force. And we're talking about, in the beginning, as this system was being formed, we're talking about slavery as part of the trade. And we're talking about values that were so clearly both misogynist and racist, and they were also anti-nature. But what happened is that as people reacted against those values, and as there were improvements in making do with a lot of the destruction caused by that system, there wasn't a rejection of the fundamentals. And the fundamentals were that global elites and global trade ended up shaping local and national economies around the world. And so that's the fundamental problem. And what's so problematic about that is we've created a system where we don't see the impact of what we do, whether we are the victims at the grassroots or the CEOs and the heads of government. We're now operating blindly and adhering to assumptions about growth, adhering to assumptions that are simply wrong, and yet we believe there's no other way. I mean, I don't know, I could say more, but I don't want to monologue too much, but, you know.
No, but I'm curious to hear. I'm just nodding along because I share your views completely. So is the root cause then of what you're describing land ownership in itself?
You see, it's not so much, you know, if we now look at where we are today, there are people who think we've got to get that land back from the landowners. That's not the main problem today. The main problem is that we have a globalized system where a global casino of trade in money and giant global corporations that are supported by that casino to continue to extract wealth from everything that lives. But tragically, over the centuries, they've ended up more and more shaping national policy. And so that, well, maybe from the outset, you know, because the left, that was often more well-intentioned, didn't question the fundamental formula, which I should also say that this formula that started with expansion from Europe, you know, going around the world to rob as many people as possible of their minerals and their wealth and so on, that system was formalized in the modern economy with the principle of comparative advantage, which said it's in your interest to specialize for export. So, you know, in Scotland, you can't grow oranges and you can't grow olives, and you should just focus on growing oats for the market. So on the surface, you could sort of understand why people might think, oh, it sounds like a good idea, but they didn't realize that previously people had managed to live rather well by having more diversified production in their own region. And it's actually remarkable how much you can do even in a very cold climate, and how people were able to have a way of life where there was no poverty as we know it, pre this elite pressure. But you have to go back, in some cases, 500 years to see that. So, and that's what gets difficult, because when people were driven off the land by the elites into cities and the urbanization, in the beginning was such a filthy mess and so much illness and gap between rich and poor, pollution. There was no infrastructure to deal with this crowding. Then, of course, later on, bringing in modernity looked like it was real progress. And that's now what we need to look at, because in some cases, it probably did improve things. But we now have to look at it with very different lenses and see what are some of the aspects of modernity and technology and science that we might want to use, and how would it look if we had a genuinely democratic process to determine what we, the people, want, and what we are voting our elected representatives to do, you know, what we're asking them to do. So
I'm honored and happy to be a part of your campaign for about the ISDS clauses. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What is it, and how do they work?
Well, also let me say how grateful we are to you for being part of it. You can't imagine what it could mean to actually get something out there and to get it out, in a way that's not antagonistic and angry and trying to blame, particular people, particular governments, particular corporations, but to do it in a common sense and compassionate way. So we're really, really thrilled to be working with you and Fatima. And what we also need to be aware of is that the algorithms are soldiers for this system now, so that we're likely to meet with opposition from the algorithms. But anyway, what happened is, as I said, with modernity, this fundamental principle, it's going to be in your interest in a region or a country to specialize for export. And then you'll be able to create so much wealth and you can import everything you need. Now, that formula really never worked very well. If you look at the truth of what happened to the land and what happened to people, what happened to a better distribution of wealth, and also what happened to the relationship between people. So one of the things that I just want to stress before we go to ISDS is that when people lived more directly related to the economy on which they depend, which is the living earth, is the water, the soil, the tree, when they lived more directly of that, they needed one another, so that there was an inevitable interdependence and a type of collaboration. And of course, in many societies, that didn't mean that everybody was exactly equally wealthy, or, it's not that this was perfect and paradise, but there was this fundamental difference that you depended on people you could see and people that you or your family or neighbors had some knowledge of the human hand in cutting down those trees or influencing the flow of the water or perhaps later on poisoning the water. So you had a structure that was very different. But when people were pushed into the city and dependent already in the early stages on unknown forces and elites and not knowing what was going on the other side of the world, you had a structural problem. So with the sort of, once we look at this, and we do see that we can learn a lot by looking at the first sort of rupture, then it sort of steps, because we can see that this system created an appetite for growth that was fundamentally expansionist, that was based on really what most civilizations have been based on. And so that includes the expansion of the Aztecs and Genghis Khan and civilization, the Moguls, that expanded before Europe expanded across the world. And I think that many people would agree that we want to support a model that allows for greater equitable distribution, and it's not based on one culture expanding and robbing other cultures of their resources, of their languages, and keeping them subservient. But so this expansionist thing that started in Europe really is behind the world wars. It led to this appetite for resources, like a structural appetite for resources beyond your boundaries. It led to huge competition between nations. And to the world wars, of course, I'm skipping over, so much history. And, I'd be very, very happy for us to have enough, money to do the research to spell out in detail how this all happened. But the basic structures are there to be seen. And so after the Second World War, tragically, a lot of well-intentioned people thought that we've got to avoid another world war, and we want to avoid another depression, which was, linked to this fight over resources, fight over oil, and so on. And what was rolled out was an even more massive, like a huge step to give global corporations more freedom, more power. So the idea was that in order to avoid another world war and to avoid another depression, we need to integrate all economic activity, and we need to set up this World Bank, a bank for the world economy, the International Monetary Fund, to monitor the flow of money around the world. And along with that, something called the GATT, which was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And interestingly enough, there were, in the Western world, there were left-leaning thinkers who were very critical of the World Bank and the IMF because they could see the way that they interacted with so-called poor countries, so-called third world, but they didn't look at global trade and they didn't look at the GATT. It's a very interesting thing, which I think has to do with the fact that the left has generally been very keen on international solidarity, on international collaboration, very understandably, but not looking, more fundamentally, and I guess I would say not understanding the way that we have to be very careful that we're not promoting just our own culture to subsume other cultures, and above all, looking what was going on the land, what was happening to the land, what was happening to the water. Why did we have, by the 60s, such clear problems with pollution and such a clear need for a more environmental and ecological approach? And also, why was the gap between rich and poor growing everywhere? But, there was a lot of good intention that went into setting up these institutions. And so later on, you were asking about ISDS, and I'm just getting to it. So there was this big step after the Second World War, and then another one by the 80s, when the corporate world was now pushing governments to go further and essentially to use the help of the military also to push governments into what was called freedom, free trade. And what it meant was they wanted governments to allow global, usually Western corporations, to have freedom to come into their economies, to have access to their resources, and to be able to move in and out freely. And along with this was also a pressure on currency to allow more control from the outside. And what was happening was that a lot of what was called aid, as we now know, was actually a way of creating debt for people, for these governments to build up an infrastructure, and that was rolling out the red carpet for global trade. So by the 80s, the corporations were putting, another push, and they called it globalization. And this globalization was marketed as this amazing way of bringing the world together, one village, it would lift all boats. And the argument was that, no two countries that have McDonald's are going to go to war. And you had, at this time, the beginnings of developing genetic engineering. Before that, the petrochemical industry was buying up seeds, and the tobacco companies were buying up seeds and food companies. So in fact, in the 70s, the largest food corporation in Sweden was Philip Morris, because they owned Kraft, and they had just bought Kraft. So, and yet most people who were now quite aware of serious environmental problems, who were rejecting the culture that was also being imposed, which was a consumer culture. I'm sorry, I'm being so long-winded. I should have gone more to ISDS.
No, it's fine. It's all very, educational and good to hear, I think, for me and for whoever's watching as well. So,
I'm going into so much detail.
No, but it's fun. I'm getting so many questions,
Yeah, so
like the whole neoliberalism and Chicago School of Economics and that whole movement and Thatcher and Reagan and all of that associations that I get.
A lot of people who will talk about neoliberalism and Reagan and so on, they're not looking at the deeper structures, and they haven't been questioning the trade agenda as central
Exactly.
to building up what is, in effect, a de facto corporate empire. So
Yeah.
they don't talk about that corporate empire,
Yeah.
and they don't talk about the fact that both left and right governments have gone along with this. Not more than that, have promoted it.
Yeah.
So Tony Blair in England, Clinton actively promoting it. So this is where we need to look a bit differently and a bit both more broadly and more deeply, to then clearly see what we need to do and to identify at the heart of this that the trade treaties were this mechanism, this tool that gave the corporations more power, when it looked like it was about trade between countries, but it was actually about the corporations wanting more freedom, and the free trade was not only giving them more freedom, but more wealth and more power and more influence. And so then pretty soon, as this modern era of globalization started, they were literally getting our governments to write in black and white contracts saying, we won't do anything that might threaten your profit. If we do, you can take us to court. And it's not a secret. People knew about it. When I say people, it wasn't kept behind closed doors exactly. And yet in Sweden, they brought in a law that trade negotiations had to be done in secrecy. Why? What I've seen over the years, working in many different countries, is that governments have naively believed that they're supporting their companies. And of course, their companies are going to have trade secrets. And by somehow supporting the global, Volvo in Sweden and Mitsubishi in Japan, on the surface, it looks like this is good for our country. And now is the time that there should be some honest reckoning and that we actually look at what this has meant.
I read an article in The Guardian by George Monbiot about the ISDS and how basically it said that in the West we always took for granted that the ISDS was a means for controlling the economies of the global South. And if anyone was going to be brought to court, it was them. I mean, meaning the countries that we as the global North exploit, right? But that we also had them in our countries. And now, it's not until now that we're seeing these laws being enforced upon the West as well. So do you think that's part of the problem as well?
I do think, it has
about
been...
that naivety of assuming that we're all part of the same team, apart from the moral arrogance of believing that we're the good guys, of course. But
again, it's not just that. I actually would argue the other way around, that many of the Western thinkers, left-leaning, who would look at trade would tend to focus more on the abuse of so-called poor countries, which was also true of George earlier, not recognizing that actually in the West, systematically destroying our farmers, systematically destroying small businesses, was having a disastrous effect on Western society. Not looking at the fact that depression, suicide, already 30, 40, 50 years ago, since I've been at this, were much more serious issues in the so-called rich countries, which then comes to our work now to really get people to look at what do we really want, what do we really mean by progress, and isn't, above all, a deep self-respect and a sense of well-being and happiness and health. Isn't that absolutely central to what we call progress? But that was all being overlooked, so I think it's truly, the big picture that where we would see that both rich countries and poor countries were being exploited by global corporations, which, now many of them have greater wealth than individual nations. And above all, they are so powerful that they're bullying nations worldwide. So even the U.S. has been sued for trying to ban chemicals and so on. So it's really the central structural problem is the creation of this sort of invisible hand. You know, we've always heard about the invisible hand of the economy, and this is truly what was created all along.
So what can we do about it?
What can we do about it? See, this is the key thing of how can we say this like really loudly and clearly? How are we going to do anything about it if almost no one has looked at it and understood the multiple costs that we're all paying? And particularly if we don't look at the fact that that systematic handover has meant that the average person, including the CEO, the super famous film star and the singer, whoever we are, we're all running faster and faster just to stay in place. We're being pressured intensely by time pressures and financial pressures. Now, you know, we can say there are lots of people who have plenty of money and who should just say, I'm not going to be pressured, but I can tell you that for sure the time pressures are there for everybody. So I think what we can do is to really do as much as we can to get this big picture out so that we build up a certain momentum to really place it on the table, to remove the polarization and divisiveness that we're locked into. If we don't step back and look at the big picture, we're getting caught up in a politics of identity. And so that means even, you know, you were saying before about land ownership. You know, even that, when we really understand what's going on, that's not the issue in terms of the land ownership within individual countries. It is the issue once we understand that we're allowing a global machine to own our land and to tell our government that if they try to prevent chemicals on that land or if they try to allow people to stay on that land, they can be sued. But so you see, it's such a fundamental driver, and once we can see that whether you're concerned with poverty and injustice, ill health, the mental, you know, the epidemic of depression and so on, or this now epidemic of divisiveness and polarization, like, you know, let's please wake up to the fact that this is something new in the last decade or so. Never existed to that degree before. And why? Comes back to that same system and the way that the technologies of mass communication have been used to divide us. So once people can see that whatever my issue is, either it was created by this system or exacerbated by it, or if I want to do something about it, there won't be any money to do something about it. And I'm not going to be having government real support to change it. So if people could really get it that whatever the issue is, from all the social issues to all the ecological, and remember the social include, you know, democracy, do we believe in democracy? Do we want our children to be healthy and happy? All, you know, climate, plastic, toxic chemicals, whatever, you know, forever wars, do we want to work for peace? So whatever our issue, we can show that not one organization or one interlinked movement is necessary. It's just that we need to be singing to the same hymn sheet. So we say, you know, my issue is climate, we need to change the economy to deal with that. My issue is the epidemic of depression, we need to change the economy to deal with that. You know, my issue is I want to do everything I can to have peace on earth. My issue is that I have real respect for cultural diversity, and I understand that this multicultural city that's being created is not what we're talking about. We're talking about people having the right to maintain their own economies, to have a right to keep their languages, to have a right to stay where they are and to have thriving economies and to be able to be creative and happy, and of course to have the freedom to travel, but we have to look at how that system fundamentally is threatened by any stability, any form of real community, any form of self-respect and self-reliance. We have a system that fundamentally is structured to destroy that. So I maybe just very quickly say about that, we have to look at how consumerism was created by that system. It really does sound evil when you truly understand. And I would say it's an evil system. It's just that the people who are, basically there aren't any people in charge driving it. That's my conviction. But it looks as though the people who are earning lots of money and are CEOs of big business are sort of running it. They are the ones pushing governments, but they're not actually running the whole empire. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I also think, it's easier to, not easier, but more coherent and accurate to blame the system rather than the individuals functioning within it, because we all do, right? No matter whether we're oppressed by the system or privileged by the system, we're all part of maintaining it, upholding it, whether we're benefiting it from or from it or suffering from it, or I would say seem to be benefiting from it, because I don't think even the people who are privileged by it actually benefit from it from a more spiritual perspective or human perspective. We're seeing that as well. It's not like the billionaires don't have depression. So I totally agree on that.
In fact, don't you think, I believe that just like globally in the rich countries there's more depression, I would say among the very rich there's more depression and addiction and serious psychological problem. I think it's particularly true, with the sort of super famous people, because it's so unnatural. Fame is so unnatural and it's so isolating, and it's so having to live up to this mask. So it's deeply dehumanizing, and I think we see the evidence. And to some extent, maybe you felt it.
Yeah, no, I'm a recovering addict myself, right? So my take on, I have a podcast called In the 12th Hour, where me and a friend from the fellowship take a look at the environmental crisis from an addiction perspective. And it really rhymes so well with everything that you're describing, because basically the way I look at it from an addiction perspective is that we're collectively stuck in an addiction. We're functioning in a system that we know will lead to catastrophic consequences, and not only are we not stopping, we're actually putting all our brain power justifying the system, even though we're not benefiting from it, because we existentially identify with it. And I've sensed a shift within the climate movement over the last 5 years, because I'm from a neighborhood in Stockholm which is traditionally working class. I'm anti-capitalistic, core programmed from childhood, right? So I have to be mindful of that as well, that of my own bias. But even so, having reflected upon it, I still believe that the economical system is the core problem, and the way that we deal with it, and the way that we treat it, and in the beginning, when I became more engaged in environmental issues, it only took me a couple of weeks before the economical system, that is the root cause. That was my most sober conclusion, including checking my own bias, right? And in the beginning, like 5-7 years ago, when I started talking about the economical system, even in rooms with climate activists, engaged people, everyone was starting to sort of, wriggle. Oh yeah, but we can't threaten economical growth. In the exact same way a cocaine addict would be threatened if you said you were going to take away his substances, or any addict, right? And I have noticed a shift now, that throughout the movement it has become more and more of a consensus that the economical problem is, the economical system is the root cause. And if you look at it again from an addiction perspective, in finding ways and finding alternatives, I think it's important to start selling the idea that it's not a compromise to move away from this current system. It's actually qualitatively preferable, right? So to get away from the compromise mindset and enter a liberation mindset. And the thing about this, the USP, if you want, is that we can promote it to anyone within the system, whether you're highly privileged within the system or oppressed by it, because it's actually beneficial for everyone, right? Moving away from this highly destructive system. And the way that it functions now, the way I look at it, is that because it is a system that is naturalized repeatedly by the worst human aspects. Greed. We say this is the economical system we have because humans are greedy. And the more ruthless you are, the more psychopathic you are, the more you're going to benefit from the system. And that's why I think we see such a, concentration of those personality traits among the top. And again, that what we can change is not them, but we can change the system that keep benefiting the worst of us.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think also what I think is that, in terms of dealing with addiction, as far as I know, Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the most effective. And what I have been promoting has always been that we've got to build community. And for me, that's one of the key elements of Alcoholics Anonymous, is that you heal as a group, as a we. You change the I to a we. And then together you go on this journey, and also together discover that you're part of something much bigger. And you partly discover that as you feel that you're on a journey with others. You start waking up to the interdependence, not just between us and nature, but human to human. And that's, again, the path fundamentally that we're talking about in terms of solving our problems. But I'd also just like to remind people that part of the addiction now has been that this empire has made everybody, no, not everybody, part of the problem is that this empire has made the majority poorer and poorer. And so I see, more than anything, I see us running in fear. Because as people are struggling to just stay in place, to pay the rent, pay the mortgage, they're having to work harder and harder. So the idea, the superficial idea of changing the economy is then very threatening, because what am I going to do? I'm already struggling to keep on top of things. And even, when there was the CEO of Exxon and the CEO of Mobil, they were running, because when that merger would come, who was going to be on top? So this mad rat race and this competition is created by an artificial system that pits us against one another, and whether we're at the very bottom or the very top. So, and then I've seen, Nobel Prize, I've spoken to Nobel Prize winning economists, they believe that they're doing what people want because they're narrowly looking how to create growth, and it's through this global trade, we all know that. It's through using more and more resources, more and more energy, and employing fewer and fewer people, dumping people on a waste heap, which now, if we go running into using AI inside that economic empire, it is like going to be a huge geometric leap in the wrong direction. So we got to really, again, look, I feel so empowered and just wishing we could get this bigger picture out, because just as you said, it's a win-win-win for the majority. It's for the majority of people on this planet. We know what we want. We do know what we want. We all want to feel connected and loved and feeling a sense of belonging, a sense of meaning, a sense of seeing a purpose in our lives. So,
definitely. If I was to sort of summarize the 12-step process, the personality transformation that it leads to is going from an extractive, what can I get out of it perspective, to how can I contribute perspective. And that in itself is pretty much the solution. And then there's like obviously all the steps in there as well. So this whole system is based on separation. It's based on separation from ourselves, from nature, from each other. And it's a manufactured lack that we need to consume or accumulate our way out of, right? So I think the most rebellious thing you can do today is I am and I have enough, right? In a sense,
yes, or
provided that the Maslow's the first steps of the Maslow's stairs of needs are met, right?
But also, what I ended up seeing so clearly, living and working in this very traditional context, and seeing how this system came in, essentially targeting little children with the message that if you want to feel that you belong, if you want to basically feel loved and connected, you've got to have those Nike running shoes, you've got to have that iPad. What's happening is that system is perverting the truly universal human need to feel loved and a sense of belonging into a need to consume.
Exactly.
So this, when you see it with the children, and you see it like I did, as it were, the first time, where, this had not ever happened before, and there wasn't that fear and insecurity, and see this perversion of this truly beneficial human need to feel a sense of belonging and love, perverted into a need to consume and elbows and competition. And so and then I see, the parents trapped, because if their child now in the peer group is being told you've got to have that to belong, otherwise you're going to be out, as a parent to then say, no, you're not going to have that, it's almost like condemning them to have no community. And that's why we need to be thinking of we. How can we start forming neighborhoods? How could we have some maybe alternative schools where we all agree that we don't want our children addicted to the screen? We want to have them out in nature more. We want to have them more creative. So,
but that's provided that we understand that about ourselves first, right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem, because a lot of parents, how are they going to teach the kids not to buy Nike shoes when they feel the need to renovate their kitchen in the latest fashion to belong in their peer group, right? Or to go traveling to the Maldives to belong in their peer group, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So that's also the struggle. Because we can't project it on the kids either. We're equally trapped in this, and I think that's why the individual and collective liberation perspective is important, and that is actually qualitatively preferable. And the problem, though, again, to connect it to the 12-step process, is that you're leaving whatever unsustainable system you're in, whether personally in addiction or consumerism or collectively, it's going to lead to a point of uncertainty, right? And you have to sort of take a leap of faith, because whenever I'm in a context when I talk about the environmental issue in this way, everyone's like, so what's the alternative? What, are we going to have communism? What's the alternative? I'm like, just expose yourself to the fact that you might not know the alternative yet, right? Just establish that, what's step one? That's, that's capitulating to the problem that this is unsustainable. I'm stuck in an addiction. I'm stuck in an economic system that is unsustainable. And then you're going to have to take a leap of faith into a process that could lead somewhere else. Because as long as all our best minds, all our invention is working within the system, none of our best brains are going to be put to use to start formulating the alternatives. But I'm glad that you've started anyway. So I'm really curious to hear about your sort of process in finding an alternative and what that looks like.
Well, you see, everything I have to say comes from having lived in a culture that wasn't colonized. And so it's just so clear from that there are certain basic principles and fundamental structures we need to return to. So from that, anything that I have to say is this absolute commitment to knowing that respecting the living diversity of this planet of which we are a part. So that, of course, starts with what most people now accept, and that is that we are a part of the earth. The air we breathe, every breath we take, our bodies, we are inextricably connected to this living planet. And what I had the chance to live in was a way of life that was adjusted and adapted to that deep foundational knowledge. We are inextricably interconnected with all of life, including other human beings, and that means that we are part of a web of life that is infinitely diverse, constantly changing, full of contradictions. And once we live in a way where we recognize, in terms of meeting our daily bread, in terms of using other people to meet our needs, that there is that interdependence, we behave in a completely different way. And it doesn't turn us into angels, but it turns us into human beings who are able to have a certain common sense and wisdom, because it becomes so obvious once we see, and we are part, therefore, of more human scale structures. So fundamental, and I have just no doubt about it, that we need to move in the direction of smaller scale economic units, and that will bring with it, which we also need to practice, a more holistic, interdisciplinary view, where we're not locked into, I'm an accountant, I'm a surveyor, I'm a doctor, I'm a musician, and I'm nothing else. When we live in that way, and I do feel empowered by having lived in that smaller scale, closer to nature, in other words, community and nature-based way of living, traditionally, and in some of the new local, ecological, more community-based and ecological hubs around the world. There are a lot of sort of special towns or even parts of bigger cities where people have started rebuilding that fabric. And the key about that is the solution is never going to be one solution. There isn't going to be one system imposed on this entire planet. And in fact, the entire direction is about, you were talking about liberating ourselves. It's about liberating ourselves from a prison that pushed us into this competitive, fear-based, artificial scarcity, because we were being pushed to live in an artificial world instead of living in the reality, which, of course, doesn't always provide the degree of comfort that we might want and so on. So that's another story we can talk about practically. But the beauty of what I'm saying is that when we live closer to the reality, we are more humble. We are more aware of the constant contradiction. It becomes so much more difficult to be prejudiced. It becomes so much more difficult to have this one idea of this is what this is and this is what this word means and nothing else. The change, the fact, every single cell in our body is unique and changing. Every single cell in every tree around us, in every drop of water, unique and changing. Once we get more in tune with that, life is so much richer, and we become so much more humble. And the thing is, when we can rest in that, when we're actually basing our way of life, where we have more real, reliable support from other people, and key in that too is much more intergenerational support. So there's a whole, that's part of it. Then we can rest in the sense of we, instead of just I, separate and alone. And it's so it makes us more humble. It makes us more relaxed. and it's so much more fun.
So practically, what does it look like?
Well,
How can you start that? How can you start that transition? Because I hear you loud and clear from a spiritual perspective, and I couldn't agree more. But what are the the tools we can use to sort of practically start moving towards that direction?
Well, I was part of a global eco-village network that friends of mine started to support ecological communities, conscious ecological communities around the world. And my work was very much trying to get them also to link up with existing traditional communities so that there could be this support across the more overdeveloped modern world and these supposedly poor areas. So there was so much learning that needed to happen. And I would say that we haven't seen it, but actually the screen, the internet, where we thought we had more knowledge than ever, we thought we had more connection, we actually have far more myths about the other side of the world now than we did 50 years ago. And so part of the key is actually much more deep, cross-cultural sharing. And, we used to organize sort of tours both ways. So for community leaders in remote parts of the world who were made to believe that they're stupid and backward because a large part of the population is still living close to the land, and who thought that New York was like the paradise on earth, for them to actually come to the West and to experience for themselves and to speak to people there who were desperately trying to change their way of life because they'd found that peak, very empty and lonely, and they were trying to find their way back. So much of the change requires a much better understanding, more exchange. It requires also, I found with the eco-villages in the West, I was just saying it to someone today, that they should have tried to learn more from indigenous cultures. And there are a lot of records from the early encounters, where people first encountered, tribal or indigenous people, talking about how they were organized, usually with great admiration and very positively, until they started taking their land, and then there was conflict, and then these people became these violent tribal people who were looked down on. But there is so much that we can learn. And very often, I guess we both need to learn from other cultures, but we also need to understand the dominant system better. If we don't, we end up focusing on what's wrong with us, and if we only could have, sociocracy instead, and we shouldn't have any private business, and we become, we're operating in a field where we don't understand that this dominant system is the main problem, and we don't strategically look at how we can liberate ourselves. You used that word several times, We're really looking for a human liberation front, and the liberation is both intellectual and, as it were, physical, although, we're not going to be physically able to go totally outside of the system, which, by the way, that's another thing. There's so many aspects where I guess I can talk from experience of working with a lot of alternative groups and eco-villages and the permaculture movement and lots of grassroots movements. So there would be a lot to say about how we might do things better, but I guess I would say in general that the main thing that's missing is a real understanding of what it is that's making it so difficult and how and why that is, so that we stop looking for solutions that ignore that profound and real reality. Does that make sense?
It does make sense in terms of establishing the problem, right? And the humility that the road ahead might not be fully paved yet, and that it might be multifaceted and multiple and pluralist, Because I mean, again, I reveal my own sort of systemic thinking when I'm asking you these questions, because I'm like, then what's the alternative and what's the practical road there, right? Because we need to expose ourselves to that uncertainty. But I'm also actively looking for new ways, right? And you're doing this whole localization, right? You're talking about the real economy and localization. Can you explain more practically what that entails?
Yeah, by the way, I also tell you I hate that word, localization. It's so long and it sounds so technical. And I brought it in reaction to the globalization that the global empire was marketing. Before that, I was using another very ugly word, decentralization, because it was so clear that everything was becoming more and more centralized, larger scale, and I was critiquing urbanization, all these "isation" words that were a consequence of this artificial system. So we do need to be, looking at the dominant system, and so the word localization does carry with it significant meaning. So first of all, it's a process of moving towards the natural world and social fabric building or community building, having recognized that the dominant system takes us further and further from nature and further from each other. So also when we recognize that that dominant path is ever more competitive and ever faster, ever larger scale, ever more energy and technology intensive, all of those things are keys for what we need to start developing to liberate ourselves. And that's, the technology part is important also because, again, when we understand that the dominant path has literally meant governments throwing away this renewable resource, human beings, overabundant renewable resource, dumped in favor of more oil, more wars, costing billions and millions of lives and billions of dollars, and now going to Mars and the deep sea for more critical minerals to build an artificial world. So and we've been sold on this idea that those technologies actually have made life more comfortable for us, when actually, it couldn't be more uncomfortable to be running so fast that you can't even breathe and you can't look after your children, your parents, yourself. So, the path that once we really understand the impoverishment and the loneliness of that path, to embrace in a more holistic way. We're then talking about subjugating not only technology, but also science to democratic scrutiny and process, to really be looking at what does science in the public interest look like? What are we looking at when we talk about health? Are we looking at creating more pharmaceuticals that bring profit to the empire? Or do we actually want to start moving towards a medical way where perhaps the priority is prevention? The priority is looking at the key things of food, exercise, and peace of mind as a way of massively reducing the illness epidemic. So we're talking about so many win-win-wins. I mean, really, we're talking about that if we asked anybody around the world, wouldn't you rather that your taxes would be used to support your local farmers to deliver chemical-free food in your area, rather than your taxes being used to build ever bigger superhighways, bigger ports, bigger airports, bigger everything, and more chemicals, more and more technology, more and more, genetic engineering to feed the world, when actually smaller diversified farms produce much more food per unit of land. So even without all those facts, you ask almost anyone, and they would say, of course I would. But sadly, because the movements have ended up fragmented with the help of the corporate empire, and I know some of the people who helped to do it, those concerned with healthy food or healthy people haven't been looking at shifting the economy and shifting it away from supporting the global to supporting the local businesses, and that even includes regional and national, depending on what you're talking about. With most basic needs for food, clothing, shelter around the world, most of that could be produced from the region. There's no absolute, and it will only, in the end, it would be a question of democratic process and discussion. But I think if people understood what's going on, the vast majority would be in favor of turning towards localization, and just how far and just what it's going to look like. Thank goodness it would also be different in different places. It's the ism. I often say localism is the ism that could end all isms. The others, capitalism, socialism, communism, all big, top-heavy systems, because it was thought that it was necessary to have that top-down bureaucratic structure to make sure that no one had a bigger house or a bigger anything, or, it's wonderful to know that there is a way forward where it would actually be possible for some people to decide to work harder and have a bit more. It would even be possible to have some interest, but not run by a global empire that we don't even see or name, but within a frame where we simply realize it's about society determining business. Business should not be shaping our values, should not be shaping our democracy. And, most capitalists don't believe in monopolies, and yet that's what we have. It couldn't be more monopolistic.
What about eco-socialism?
What about eco-socialism?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I've been reading Jason Hickel, his book, Less is More on degrowth, because I feel like him, and there's an institute in Barcelona where you can study degrowth, etc. I think that is the ism that is more aligned with your formulation about the problem, because it definitely does look to global injustice. It does look to these, the economical system as a root cause of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And because I'm thinking in the search of new ways, right? That is something that is appealing to me.
Yeah.
Some sort of eco-socialistic framework. And he's also talking a lot about a more democratic economy, right? Where the people, you can control production for the best interests of the people, basically, and not for the interest of the corporate, elites. Do you think that there could be potentially a sort of combination of the two? Because I can see like localization. I see a few risks with that. One is that there's a risk that it will build on the injustice that already is, that there's the money that has now been accumulated as a result of colonialism in the West, that money is going to be used to create these hubs of eco-friendly hubs, that it's not going to benefit a lot of people who are now suffering or being oppressed by economical system at hand. So that I see that as a risk, and I also see it as a risk in terms of neo-nationalist movements as well, that it can be argued in that sense, in a racist sense as well. I come from a cultural big city, even though it's not huge, but it's Stockholm, and I love it. I love the blending of cultures. For me, that's I'm also sort of like reluctant to fully embrace the idea that, certain people belong to certain land. To me, it's more a matter of how do you treat the land, right? that there's no
How do you
genetic.
what? Say, is there more what?
How do you treat the land, right?
Yeah.
I'm more interested in indigenous practice rather than the DNA of a specific indigenous people, just the whole idea of a claim to land belonging to a certain group or a certain. I mean, there are risks there. I feel like can be hijacked by interests that I wouldn't align with. So those are the two risks I see with localization, being built on an already existing injustice and also paving way for further ethno-nationalism.
Very good questions. You see, first of all, if you really look at what I'm talking about, moving away from a global interlinked empire of corporations and banks, which, by the way, you really need to look at the fact that increasingly and for a very long time, the elites in the so-called poor countries were part of the system. It benefited them that they could sell their products at a lower price in the global market by having essentially their slave labor. So when you look at it honestly, and you also now would look at where are the billionaires being created, there are a lot, all over the world.
In Stockholm at the moment.
Sorry?
In Stockholm at the moment.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah, but all over the world you'll find them. So, and what I am seeing is that when we're talking here about moving away from a dependence where everybody is dependent on this global empire towards being dependent on economies, and that also means technological systems that are subservient to a social fabric. The idea that the rich countries will be better off than the poor countries is simply wrong. I mean, if tomorrow we had a world dictator, say I become empress of the world, and I'm able to dictate what's going to happen, and I say from now on you're just going to eat local food and you're just going to be living off your local economy, guess who would be worse off? People in the rich countries. We have almost no skills, we don't have access to the land, we don't even have the knowledge that many people have in the so-called poor countries. So I would argue that unfortunately so much of the left has simply not been spending enough time on the ground and contrasting and comparing and seeing the changes. I think in my case, the reason I became so alert to the trade thing was I was every year in this other part of the world, and I saw these big industries coming in and starting to, bring people into these slave-like conditions to, produce running shoes for the West. Well, thank goodness, in many of those countries, 50%, sometimes a bit less, but a much larger percentage of people still know how to grow food, still know how to make their own shoes and their own clothes, whereas in the West, 1% is farming, and not even 1% actually properly farming. So if I, as an empress, insisted on this draconian thing where everybody was just going to survive off their own local economy, people in the West would be the worst off, by far. So it's really just, again, not looking at this in a holistic way and seeing what it means to start moving towards a more self-reliant economy that is more in tune with keeping your water and your soil alive and learning how to live off that. So this is something that is not going to... See, the beauty of it also is that it couldn't be imposed like some kind of Trump-like ban on trade. Because say, for instance, if tomorrow in Sweden there would be a policy shift so that Sweden, to the extent that it produces food, is producing food for Sweden, it wouldn't be a sudden ban on imports from, say, some country in South America or or Asia that's producing something for Sweden, because it's going to take time for a country to become more self-reliant. So that other country that is now basing their economy on exporting to Sweden also has time to shift production to start feeding themselves. You see? So whereas when you suddenly have, I'm trying to think of the term, what is the term? When you suddenly have not a blockade, but a, anyway, you know, so this is not something that is going to be a sudden shift. You have this amazing and beautiful way in which on both sides of this divide, as we have real people power, we start doing what's in the interest of people on both sides. And this is very much based on, like I said, deeper international collaboration, much deeper knowledge about the truth of what's going on both sides of this artificial divide. And the artificial divide is very real. You know, there are very real differences, but the differences are not what we're told. They're not, you know, like I say, if you really look carefully, you will see that there is still far less depression. It's changing very rapidly because the system, you know, is more and more toxic. But less depression, less suicide, less addiction in those so-called poor parts of the world. So I know that you would agree if you really experienced that and looked at it, that you have to say, we really do need to start thinking about what wealth really is. And this is not to trivialize or to, you know, deny the fact that there is some very real and very frightening poverty. But sadly, a lot of that has increased massively with the help of left-leaning people who didn't question the trade thing, who believed, you know, Clinton and Blair when they said, oh, no, don't you be selfish. Those factories moving over there, the factory moving to Mexico or moving to India and China, that's in order to lift all boats. We're all going to become wealthier. If you look at the truth of what that has led to is more poverty than before. So,
but I do feel that the new voices, because
sorry?
Sorry, I'm going to move closer to the mic. I do feel that the new voices, like Jason Hickel and the degrowth movement and the eco-socialist movement, do include this perspective a lot. I mean, it's based on this perspective on global justice and environment. Whereas traditionally socialism has all, I mean, because the core problem as formulated from the eco-socialist movement, I would say, is, you know, the idea that the economical system built on imperative growth on a planet with finite resources, right? That is the core problem. And it criticizes traditional socialism because it's also built on economical growth. It's just a matter of a distribution, right? But it's also dependent on economical growth. Whereas there is so many, you know, researchers now focusing on different ways of quantifying a country's success, right? Well-being, economy, etc. I'm just trying to look for, you know, positive roads ahead for a more just and sustainable world, right?
Yeah.
In which I think localization could be a part of that, but I can't really see that it's the only way or the only path that acknowledges the problem at its root cause. And I see another risk with it being, is it scalable enough? Is it fast enough? Is it potent enough? Or in and of itself? I mean, as a tool within an eco-socialist movement, I can see it definitely, you know, be something that it would build a way more resilient economy, a more that could stand, you know, all the tests we are seeing right now, right, with the geopolitical uncertainty, etc. I'm just trying to find, like, what's the framework?
Yeah, well, I would say that I know Jason very well. I respect him. The man who started the degrowth movement is a friend of mine, Serge Latouche, French, who has spent time in Africa. And so certainly with Serge, we see eye to eye completely, and he, I guess, still preferred the language of degrowth. For me, that's a more narrow look at what everybody recognizes, which is that the way that GDP is measured is just crazy. But I am disappointed that people like Jason and a lot of the degrowth people are not willing to talk about this empire and breaking it up. And I just see again and again that people want to circulate around that, we need a more just way, we need a more ecological way. Yes, we do. But if our governments are locked into signing away their right to do something that will protect their people and their environment, we're not going to get it. So I would be happy to think of other labels of the ideal of what we want. And I guess in a way, like I said, I don't like localization. I think for me, eco-socialism wouldn't work as well as localization in terms of building up a movement. Because I think, again, for many people, like in the villages of China or India or whatever, they would sound a bit intellectual and a bit remote, whereas if we said, they're supporting those global corporations that don't even pay tax, and they have no rules for them. In other words, they, instead of putting rules on your government, let's start by changing that. Let's start by liberating ourselves so that we can start looking at what do we actually want. Again, the local, I think, is more pragmatic and can appeal to more people. And even in the West, eco-socialism can sound too intellectual and a bit too green for people who are struggling to put food on the table and to survive. And amazingly, by shifting policies in food production and looking at supporting local independent businesses, they would actually start to become more ecological, inevitably. Because you see, the ecological as an idea, when you're talking about, I got that food from the other side of the world and I'm being told that it was produced ecologically, well, I want to see a bit more accountability and visibility for more people. And we now know how much all that information can be manipulated. But again, I completely understand that, the sort of thinking that we're talking now about everybody moving towards becoming like really indigenous again and seeming like they're not going to go anywhere, they're not going to travel, and there's not going to be, that cultural exchange. That is not what I'm saying, but I can understand it sounds that way because I start with the indigenous. But, I could say a lot more about it because the new local, generally speaking, in the world is being created by people who have a lot of international experience, and it's often hubs that are quite international, but they're quite different from those multicultural hubs in the big cities. They're, where, as I see it, a lot of people have had their economies destroyed, their cultures, their identities, and they're pouring in, and often in a subservient role to the dominant culture, to the home culture. And seeing that even in remote places, remote
but
traditional
isn't there a risk for just creating a sort of, a new elite then? Because these hubs with people who have been privileged enough to be able to travel, to sort of have the privilege to maybe economically create a farm or know people that do, etc. I'm talking about the vast majority of the West that are urbanized, right?
Yeah.
That feel like their main agency might be how they put their vote every fourth year. And where should they put that vote?
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Do you know what I mean? So like,
Yeah.
for them, for the people who are oppressed by the system, living in suburbs in horrible conditions, who don't even know, like, what about them? Because
Yeah.
I'm afraid that this would just be sort of like again another privileged sort of in-group movement for people who have the means or the capability to make this sort of shift, whereas people who are stuck on the treadmill, who don't even know that they're on a treadmill, because I feel like we need to reach them. And how do we present them with a political alternative, right?
Exactly. But you see, that's where, exactly for those people, to come with eco-socialism or degrowth is not likely to mobilize them in the same way that local will. And you see, then let's talk about the policy shift that I hope we can share. Let's look at the fact that what we want to do is to shift that system whereby governments are not allowed to raise the minimum wage, are not allowed to protect the environment and to protect the health of their people. So we're talking about that as a priority. And we're saying to people, look at these key mechanisms economically that governments use, what they tax, how they use those taxes to subsidize and to invest in infrastructure, in research and development. And they're using your taxes to make global corporations richer, while your area, your town, your country, and all around the world, people in every country are being made poorer in order to enrich these people who prance around globally and who pay no taxes. And they were saying, not only that, but they're using our laws, our regulations, to say to these global players that they don't need to have any rules at all. In fact, they can start taking your government to court if they try to prevent them from making money out of you and your economy. So we're saying, let's start right now to build up a campaign so that we have real clear, and we're not afraid to talk about the corporate thing. That's what I feel, I worry that others are, and why they don't name it as the central problem, as a structure, and talk about how they got so much richer and how these ISDS clauses any sane person would reject.
I've read The Divide that Jason Hickel wrote. He didn't specifically write about ISDS because, the first time I heard about it was from you. And I've asked people around in the environmental movement, and no one has an idea about it. So I'm maybe just people aren't aware enough of it within the movement and how backbound governments are to formulate their own.
But Jason is. We've spoken together. We've been on the same platform. He's heard me talk about it. George has heard me talk about it for 30 years or something. And then, I was interviewed by the New York Times a few years ago, a big profile on me. And then it comes out, nothing about the trade treaties. It's all about local food. And you see, that's okay, because it doesn't really threaten the corporate thing. And I say to the guy who was the head of the New York Times here in Australia, why didn't you? And that's like the fifth or sixth time that I've been interviewed, and whether in Florence or here or around the world. Oh, too technical. People don't want to hear about it. But I don't think that's what it is. I think there's some kind of self-editing. Because, you as just, a thoughtful person who wants to try to look at what's happening, you said, of course this is of fundamental importance. Of course this is something people should know about. Of course we should change that. That's the logical reaction. And,
I think that's the reaction any sane person would have to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, that's why I think this campaign is important, to really get that message out there. And then, because regardless of how we look at different solutions and how how we scale them, we all want the same thing. We want the species to survive on this planet, right? And biodiversity survive as well.
Yeah.
That's the end. That's the end goal, right?
Yeah.
Or that's the direction anyway, right?
Yeah.
For me, I think it's crucial that people find out how limited their democracy really is. And I think that's the main thing, regardless of your interpretation of the solutions, and that can be debatable,
Yes.
But again, coming to the point of formulating the problem, we know the pseudo
Yeah.
democracy that we're living in, and
Yeah.
to expose that,
Yeah.
both in terms of private funding in elections, etc., with Citizen United in America and in
Yeah.
Sweden as well. It's like how to really, because we love to beat our own chest in the West and praise our own democracy, but really how democratic is it? And that's something I think that people need to wake up to.
Yeah. But so you see, I mean, would you agree that it's fair enough to talk about how those global corporations need to come back to place? They need to be localized. Isn't that what
100%.
we would agree on? So then
100%. At least
okay.
for
Yeah.
governments to be able to formulate their own
Yeah.
laws, and
Yeah.
especially in terms
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
environment and
Yeah.
social issues.
Yeah. And so
Of course.
that's what I'm saying. And I'm saying that is a prerequisite for the flourishing of diversity and
Yeah.
and then, some people might call it what we want to see eco-socialism, other people might call it something else, but the prerequisite is that we can't be run by this invisible empire, and over
No.
which we have no control and we don't
No.
even know what they're up to.
But I guess, I mean, that might be a later question, but once people are informed about this, where do they cast the ballot? How do they vote? Because I see no alternatives in Sweden, at least, where people are actually acknowledging this problem. I don't see it in America either, with a bipartisan system.
But see, again, if you look at all the evidence of a relatively small group having started huge social changes like civil rights and women's rights and so on around the world. So, how often you hear that about how, small groups of people can, by coming together, can start the ball rolling for fundamental change. And remember, we've never before had a movement where literally everybody, from those concerned with poverty to those concerned with the environment, had a reason to link hands because of this one corporate empire to change that. And then, so that means that by building up a certain momentum, we'll be looking for political representatives who say, yeah, this is what I'm going to represent. I'm going to be, and then what we're saying is, I think it's strategic. I realized, so often, and you were saying too, it's very hard to just step off by yourself. And you were saying, let's have courage. I guess maybe I, as a woman, I'm trying to encourage people to do it more as a group, just like in AA, that as a group we can be stronger and support each other for this healing and this getting off the addiction. And in the same way, to start a sort of political movement, if we have, these smaller groups of people coming together and then with clarity saying to the government, we realize that you alone, so in Sweden, it'd be pretty hard for you on your own to say, okay, we're not listening to this corporate empire anymore. So what we're suggesting is what I call a breakaway strategy, where Sweden, we are pressuring the current, we're pressuring the current representatives who aren't actually representing us, but there they are. And we're looking for new voices who are going to stand up and say, I'm going to try to do this. And they will have the mandate to start talking to other countries that would be open to forming a group that could break away from the stranglehold, that could start liberating themselves by talking to each other. How can we as a group start supporting each other to reduce our dependence on that empire? And the scary thing is that the military is wedded to this. But that's part of what we have to understand, that's fear-based, and they are so afraid of monsters that essentially those same corporations have created by imposing everywhere a resource-hungry, an appetite to chew up more and more and more. How on earth is there going to be anything but fear and destruction? So again, about localizing, it's coming back. So a business will start producing where it's selling in the region, and they'll have to be living in the mess that they create. So we used to call it, site here to sell here, but we're not going to be on the other side of the world with a filthy factory and then selling to us here. So again, it doesn't mean there can't be trade. It doesn't mean there couldn't be collaboration between different industries, but all the time with democratic oversight. So part of the mandate would also be that as these processes start at the government level, we want civic society representatives at the table. And I'm very grateful for our colleague who's been at all the COPs, because in Brazil, they had a mandate that there had to be someone from civic society. So she's been at the table and seen how it's the corporations running the show and how incredibly destructive and corrupt it is. And so we want to have that mandate that we understand you can't just suddenly break away, but you need to start the process now and help us with the discussion. I got in to see Clinton's chief economic advisor, and I was saying, to her and message to him, I totally understand that you can't suddenly turn against this, but you could help us. We now have quite an organization here of people from all around the world talking about how these trade treaties are destroying their economies and their democracies, and you could help, indirectly to give space and a voice to this. You can quietly start discussions. My dream, was that Prince Charles would do this, because he really was quite wise. I don't know. I had private meetings with him, and he really was seriously thoughtful. And you may not believe that, but honestly. But anyway, it's too late with him now, I think. But someone who could bring together retired generals, especially from the military, retired generals, retired CEOs, retired, prime ministers, to really look at this honestly and start a discussion. Because it's so common sense what I'm saying, honestly, Gustaf, and it's not at all imposing some kind of localized reality for everybody that's some kind of right-wing, way forward. Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah. I must let you talk more. I'm very grateful that you forgive me for going on, but it's...
No, I'm here to listen to you. So I'm just happy to hear you. I mean, what is this empire then? Because I see one empire at work, which is the U.S., the American empire.
Yeah.
To what degree is the empire you're talking about, the same as America? To what degree is it different? And how is the military coupled to it?
As I became aware of this, I was just saying again and again that the American military and elite that was pushing for this trade malarkey just were not facing the fact that they were impoverishing their own people more and more. And, if you go to Appalachia and look at the abject poverty, people born into trailers that lose value the day you buy them, and then, the right-wing media, that creates the fear of the dark skins and of the immigrants, and it's just horrendous. And the worst poverty, really, in the world that I've seen anywhere is in America. And they were, like so many country leaders, believing that they were helping their multinationals, and that was helping their country. And I remember there was a time when Mitsubishi said to Japan, no, sorry, we're not really Japanese anymore. And someone I had influenced who was working in Volkswagen, they had a discussion, what makes us German? We're producing in Brazil and selling in China. What makes us German? So anyway, it's like, it's happened sort of blindly and unwittingly, but the elite's pushing this. I am afraid that they woke up to this and they decided they wanted Trump. So now, in this primitive way, They think, oh, yeah, we're going to stop this kind of trade, and anybody who doesn't love America, because we do want to make America great again. But then they're opening their doors wide to be raped by AI investors from any and everywhere. And they think, did I tell you I was invited by U.S. intelligence to do a seminar on localization? Did I tell you that?
You mentioned it.
Yeah, so that, and they clearly wanted me to believe that the internet and 3D printing, all of that was helping to decentralize the economy and to localize the economy. But then later on, they send me this report where they are saying in black and white, they sent to me. It's got on the top, for official use only. And it's just the entire report is about how the fusion of humans and technology is the way forward. And, of course, we've got to be ahead. We have to be on top. So we are in the grips of a fear-based system where the military working with Silicon Valley and the money creation, which is also technology. Money is a technology, and it's being created out of thin air, and it's being created to enrich those out-of-sight global players. So, until structurally they get what they're doing, but again, I think I do feel there's hope because I have some conservative friends who, for years, I was saying, got to try to have some kind of leader bring together people. And then they were saying, no, we have no choice because we've got to be ahead of China, otherwise China. But now they're beginning to say, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think we really have to look at how we can persuade America that they are the most powerful. They have these military bases everywhere. They do not need to be afraid of China, and they could have the possibility of detente, to the extent that they're not going to continue with this escalation. And the escalation to the deep sea bottom, they're destroying the whales, they're destroying everything out of the sphere. And they're fearful of a monster they created. So America has certainly been the biggest driver, but not the American people. The American people have often been the most articulate, the most aware of what corporate rule looks like. So there are more people in America who have written books about corporate rule and who have been questioning this because, in Sweden we had a thick layer of protection from a relatively benign government. So we weren't so aware of the stuff behind it. Whereas in America it was like, the corporate world was coming in with their advertising and their power into the country much more directly, and the government provided almost no protection. You've lived in America. Yeah, and so I think the American people impoverished, and many of the American people aware, but yeah, the real, and then Trump, he talks about deep state and all that, and I heard a very intelligent, I think probably originally a Swede working in the State Department, saying how he became suspicious when after September 11th, there was all this money suddenly going to go into Iraq, which had nothing to do with September 11th. And he started looking at it and he realized, again, this Silicon Valley and the money-making and intelligence creating this manufacturing of technology and wealth. And suddenly, the trillions for the war and some poverty. Do we even have 1 million to deal with that? Yeah. So that's why, ideally, if we could find people of influence who would bring together, like I say, if they need to be retired, they need to be retired. A book came out in America that was looking at how Khrushchev and Kennedy had to write letters to each other in secrecy because their bureaucracies on both sides would not let them communicate. And so you have this sort of monstrous system built up, with this fear, and people working in a specialized way all the time inside that fear-based competitive system. And you know, it's not that we can, anyway, I mean, saying that can make a lot of people say, well, it's all hopeless. But I don't believe it is.
No. Me neither. I believe in the human capacity to change.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I had this, I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with an economist who had proposed this new idea that you would tax socially and environmentally unsustainable goods towards the customer, right? And my first questions were about, well, you know, why not tax the companies, the corporations, right? Because again, there will be people who can afford these goods then, and then there will be people who cannot, right?
Yeah.
So I think it would just exacerbate inequality. And then he said that he had come up with a system so he could save the market. He could save the market economy. And I was like, but that wasn't the point, right? He's like, no, to save Earth. I was like, okay. And then we talked, and then he called me a pessimist because I didn't believe in the market economy and this economical system.
I know.
And I'm like, okay, but I am an optimist because I believe in the human capacity to change, because I've seen it in myself and I've seen it in thousands of people recovering from highly unsustainable behaviors. So I do believe that we're a young species and we're at a crossroads now where either we mature or we get extinct.
Yeah.
That's what I believe. And I think that's possible. I think that's where I at least place my hope.
Yeah.
And he called me the pessimist because
I
he didn't believe in human change at all.
Yeah.
He said, no, humans will be humans, people will be people, and again used our least flattering traits to naturalize this system, right? Humans are greedy. I was like, no, we're collaborative. You know, we're not. That's not. We did not survive as a species because of greed. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting because he called me the pessimist, and to me, he was the cynic because he didn't even believe in the human capability to change.
Exactly. And
I think we do have to change individually and collectively.
Yeah. So when did you first wake up to all of this?
I don't know. I think it might have been sort of gradual. I've always been sort of aware of the environmental risks, and I don't know. I was young. I smoked a lot of weed, so I already had an alternative worldview. I listened to hip hop and reggae music, so it was sort of like didn't ascribe to what was presented to me by my own culture or my own country. And then I think it was gradual, but it wasn't until I was in recovery and the 12th step is having gone through these 12, as a result of having gone through these 12 steps, having had a spiritual awakening, we try to spread this message and apply these principles in all our affairs, right? And to me, this is the most pressing affair, the survival of the species, right? And then I've been an ambassador for Greenpeace for quite a few years, and I was invited to go with them to the Antarctica in 2020, and that's sort of when I had this revelation that we're collectively stuck in an addiction. Yeah. This whole economical system is an addiction, no matter how you look at it. Yeah. And that the behavior is so similar to the one that I was trapped in. I've seen thousands of people be trapped in. The fact that you sort of consciously or subconsciously know that the path that you're on is going to lead to inevitable disaster, and still you cannot even imagine an alternative. Because that's the thing. When you're stuck in addiction, the whole idea that you're going to live without your substances is like you might as well die, right? And that's why you cling on to it so desperately. And even biochemically, it sits in your primal brain that you're identified with a system that you need to protect it at any cost, right? And then having gone through that liberation process, which is recovery, or going through it because you have to stay at it, otherwise I would relapse, right? But going through that process and having had the experience of being stuck in something so destructive that I still clang on to, and then having had the liberating experience of moving away from that, realizing, looking back, I was like, how could I ever have thought that that was, you know, worth defending or worth. So I think it's sort of like it merged then, sort of like my personal work, my spiritual work, and my social work for me.
Yeah.
And I think it's working, you know. And again, to be of service, right?
Yeah.
To be of service and to reduce your ego. Like, I don't care about, you know, social media today. Everyone is like, oh, you're a virtuous. I don't give a fuck if people think I'm good or bad.
Oh,
Like, in
good.
my own recovery process, I have had to transcend the moralistic.
Yeah.
I'm not moralistically binary. I don't believe in a black and white, good or
Yeah.
evil. I'm neither, and I'm both, and I'm, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
It's morality is functional. It's never absolute, at
Yeah.
least not in this relative universe,
I
right?
totally agree. Yeah.
So I think that's where I'm trying to work from, right? It's not about me. It's about how can I be of service to something greater than me, and in this case, it's Mother Earth and all her inhabitants.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm here.
Yeah. You know, for me, I guess I got so motivated because I could just see, you know, people becoming more greedy, more frightened, more pollution. And also, actually, my mother was dying of cancer when I came back, having been in Ladakh for 3 years. And I was so aware that there basically was no cancer. So it really motivated me, you know. And so in a way, it's just, yeah, just not wanting to live in a world where you just see this unnecessary illness, suffering, greed, and breakdown. It's all so unnecessary. It's all because people just aren't seeing what's going on. And it's wonderful, you know, that we can see around the world that very often what brings people onto this track is either mental illness, addiction, or also physical illness. That somehow, that in us is the desire, you know, to be of service, to belong, to be doing the right thing.